for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening to the sound bites. Tonight we are very honored to have Lieutenant Governor David Zuckerman, who, as you know, is running for governor. I almost said lieutenant governor. For governor, he is currently the lieutenant governor. David, welcome on the show.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yes, great. You've been
I've been on a few times.
Yes, you have.
Yeah, I always enjoy it.
And joining me is Eric Lamontagne, who's Executive Director of Campaign for Vermont and a co-partner in this. I just have to ask you, where's the ice cream? Did you bring us any?
The ice cream is going to be raffled off to any donor between now and the 14th of September. For those that haven't heard, thank you for the tip to it. Ben Cohen, the famous Ben of Ben and Jerry's, is whipping up a small batch of 8 pints of ice cream.
Excellent.
That is very Vermont focused and Vermont ag focused. So it's a vanilla ice cream that has strawberry chunks that are dipped in maple.
Oh, stop.
With a blueberry ripple. And he's going to hand make it, hand fold it in. And there are 8 people who are going to win these pints of ice cream, and they designed a whole container. I'm going to get to have a container. I tell you what, like, okay, I'm Lieutenant Governor of Vermont, but for the rest of my life, this is going to be like one of the bigger achievements. I got onto a container.
Exactly.
It's Ben's Best. It's not technically Ben and Jerry's because that's a trademarked name and everything, but it certainly looks like a Ben and Jerry's pint.
It looks like it.
And we're having a lot of fun with it, and it's going viral all over social media, and people are pretty good,
Now,
right?
if you win that, do you actually eat it, or does that one of those 8 pints just sit in your freezer?
Oh no, I would
4
certainly
years?
eat it and then gently
save
clean the container and let
save
it
the
dry.
container.
And someone else just pointed out to me, serendipitously, it's also red, white, and blue.
Oh,
Strawberries,
perfect.
vanilla ice cream, and blueberries.
Oh, good for Ben.
So he covered. It's called Zuckermania.
Oh, I saw that and I went, damn, this man has made it.
I know, right? It's like that's bigger on my bucket list.
Exactly.
All you have to do is spend 9 months, running for office after 22 years of public service to get that. Everybody should just go out there and do it.
That's so cool. That is good for you.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Anyway, so I'm sure a lot of people know who you are, but we'd certainly like you to go over a little bit of your background and
Sure.
get them up to speed. Here we are.
I'm not a born Vermonter. Surprise.
Not either. That's okay.
I moved here in 1989 to go to the University of Vermont and fell in love and stayed here ever since. In 92, I had volunteered for Bernie's campaign, or actually, first I saw Bernie in 92. I was not interested in electoral politics. I was very much an organizer, an activist, these big, terrible words in some people's minds, but someone who just really was out there trying to expand information for people. That's a lot of times what an organizer and an activist is offering information and trying to change people's minds. And I thought change really comes from the ground up. And I thought politicians, especially in Washington, they're too disconnected. And I saw Bernie speak, and I was like, here's a guy that doesn't take corporate donations, which for me that was an issue, isn't for everybody, who said exactly what he believed, whether you agree with him or not. He didn't mince his words and soft, mealy-mouthed things the way some political figures do. And I thought, wow, I could get behind this guy. So I volunteered for him, met a lot of people involved in affordable housing issues and economic justice issues and a range of progressive causes, and volunteered for some of them. And in 1994, someone asked me to run, and I ran and lost. I lost by 59 votes, and it'll be in the news by the time this is out, but Senator Chris Pearson's recount just finished. I don't know if you know, in the
I didn't know he was
Chittenden County Senate race, he had won by 42 votes out of
this
tens
is against
of thousands.
June?
Yeah, right.
Oh, right.
And she asked for a recount and closed it to 28 votes, but that was just settled a couple hours ago.
Yeah.
So votes are close in Vermont, So I lost by 59 votes the first time, and that was for the House seat, a much smaller seat. And but then I won. So 7 terms in the House. I served on natural resources and energy. I served on agriculture, including 4 years as chair. And then I served for 2 years on Ways and Means. And then I left the legislature, I left politics. My spouse and I found land we could buy to move our farm from rented land in the Intervale in Burlington to owning land, or at least owing the bank a lot of money to work the land. And we've been there since. And 2 years later, a Senate seat opened, ran for that, served for 4 years there. And in 2016, I won the seat for lieutenant governor. And certainly, there's a number of issues we could talk about that I worked on a lot, but I was a leader on raising minimum wage, cannabis reform, marriage equality, end-of-life choices. I've done a lot of work on affordable housing as well. So, and environmental issues.
Yeah, the affordable housing issue is something I really get involved in
Yeah.
in my backyard. I mean, it's bad.
It's
Because
really
the
hard.
homeless situation here is it's disgraceful.
And it's getting worse.
Oh, it
I
is.
live right outside of Burlington, and I see it in downtown Burlington. Every year, it seems like there's more and more people.
Well, we're really in a bind here because we're a very attractive place to live. In general, there's a lot of people just a few hours away that have economic resources well beyond average Vermonters.
Right.
We're seeing it right now with COVID, that people are leaving the urban areas and looking
Yeah.
to get retreats in
Yeah.
the safety of open space. And so what I've heard from realtors is there has been a real rush on properties
Right.
in Vermont.
Exactly.
And that's going to really exacerbate this problem because for someone to buy a home for $350,000 or $400,000 in Vermont, after having sold a $600,000 or $800,000 property in suburban,
Right.
or $1 million property in suburban Boston or New York,
Right.
they'll do it in a heartbeat. And yet here, our wages are 18% below the regional average. And so I think we're going to see that as a bigger problem. And that's just free market, right? I mean, we're in the homestead area
Yeah.
of Boston and New York, and we just don't
They
have.
had pictures in the newspaper about all these people leaving New York because they're frightened to death
Right.
and they want to get out where it's safe.
And it's a two-edged sword. It's a real opportunity for Vermont. We might attract
Yeah.
some families and some
Yeah.
people with money who,
Yes, revenue.
want to start businesses or
Yeah.
entrepreneurial spirit. But it's going to really put a crunch on affordable housing, which is what got us into this
Right.
topic. And I think we need to invest in affordable housing,
Yeah,
which
I
is
agree with
one
you.
of the topics.
Totally.
Yep.
Yeah, we did a show on homelessness. I got so many responses from that, people calling me directly. And we're going to do, as soon as I get finished interviewing all the candidates, we're going to do another one on how bad the homeless situation is.
Sue Minter would be great to talk to
Oh,
about
yes,
that,
of course,
with
now in her new
Capstone.
job.
Yeah,
Yep,
yeah,
that's right.
She's really working with a lot of
love
folks
her.
who are struggling, and
Yeah.
her knowledge and especially in this area
Yeah.
of the state, I think is worth
Yeah,
considering.
she's so dynamic. I love Sue.
Yep.
That's good. Cool.
Well, let's talk about your accomplishments as Lieutenant Governor. Are there two or three
Sure.
that stick out to you that you'd like to
Well,
let us know about?
it's an interesting job. Normally as a legislator, you talk about legislation you proposed and you
Right.
helped usher through the system and build support with your colleagues to make happen. And I certainly did a fair amount of that. As Lieutenant Governor, your job description is not so much to pass bills. In fact, you're supposed to be a neutral
Yeah.
parliamentarian of the Senate. You're supposed to appoint committees so that they have diverse, well, there's no rule, but there's a institutional formality and respect that you want diversity on each committee of viewpoints to make sure you kick the tires on
Right.
any bill from every direction. And of course, you're supposed to be prepared to be governor if something happens,
Right.
hopefully not,
Right.
to the governor.
Right.
So then you kind of determine your path beyond that. And given that I was first elected in 2016, which was the same night that our president was elected, Governor Scott was newly elected. We had a
Wow.
new speaker that year,
Right.
and we had a new president pro tem. I mean,
Right.
it was a whole new slate.
Wow.
But the governor had indicated to me soon after the election that I would not be particularly involved with his administration. And we're different parties. I get that. It's been not involved at all, which is a little different than
Right.
less involved,
I
which
was
is what I
very
expected.
surprised you were telling about
Yeah.
that before the show. That you've only met with him once, perhaps?
Well, and we can get to that. But he told me in transition office in late November that year when we got elected that they did not intend to include me in much of the administrative
Wow.
actions, no cabinet meetings and so forth. And I get that. They want to be able to think about their own ideas. But literally, I have been in one face-to-face meeting solo.
That's really shocking.
It was 30 minutes in June of 17
Right.
at my request. It took actually a long time for us to just get their press releases. The governor has informed my office typically 10 to 30 minutes before he leaves the state. And when he leaves the state, I become acting governor.
Right.
So I've often had no notice until when it happens.
Wow.
But back to, and I'm happy to talk about
No,
both.
that's, yeah.
But so I sort of thought about what do we need right now with this energy that comes out of Washington? And I would argue it's mostly the president, but there's a lot of other energy that's just negative about civics and engagement and reasonable discourse.
Right.
And so I kind of donned a metaphorical hat as an ambassador of democracy. And I've traveled to schools, prior to COVID, of course, schools all over the state. I've hosted town meetings all over the state, not so much about, David Zuckerman's agenda,
Right.
but about engagement. How do you talk to your legislator? How do you reach out? We now have people that will call a legislator, and you, of course, were a legislator. And instead of saying, Representative McDonald, what are your thoughts on this issue? I've heard this is being discussed, or I'm concerned about this. Here's my views. They go, you better do this. You better do that.
Right.
And everyone has a right to their opinion. But what I was trying to do with folks is say, we have reasonable conversations in Montpelier. Sometimes it's not always portrayed that way, but particularly in committee and in the halls and in the cafeteria. And if you reach out to your legislator about an issue, you may know more about it than they do.
Yep.
You may be a resource for them. So present yourself
Good idea.
as an information, as a Britannica book that says, on this topic, it's a passion of mine. Do you know if anything's happening on it? If so, where do you stand? And can I offer you more information? Just to help people realize they're all humans. Last I checked, you're still human.
I am still.
I'm still human.
Old, but
and,
a human.
and so, we make mistakes and we want to learn information. And so I would say a big piece of my work was really trying to reinstill democracy in this age when it's just so divided.
'Cause that was the thing that impressed me the most when I moved to Vermont, because I came from New York and we worked with Albany in my company. And God, that was such a formal thing. But here, we had a guy in motor vehicles changed a major law all by himself. Talked to me, talked to the legislature, and the law was changed. Your access is incredible. I don't think people realize how accessible legislators are.
And people's experience matters.
Yeah, exactly.
What happened to you going through the DMV?
Right.
What happened to you with this town issue and how town governance was or
Good for
wasn't
you.
as open? And people, thankfully, when I look around the country and you hear people speaking and sort of talking with how government's not responsive, or you'd never see your representative on the street. Here they're like, I bumped into Bernie the other day. I bumped into Congressman Welsh. I saw Governor Scott at the racetrack. I saw David at the farmer's market. It's still a human scale, which is really fortunate.
And did you do any work on the flip side of that coin? We've heard from folks before that when we put out calls to action that, well, it's not worth our time. Nobody ever acknowledges me when I send something in. I never get a response. I never hear anything back. It all just falls on deaf ears.
Well, I have found that that same answer. I've had people call the lieutenant governor's office and say, I called my rep, I called my senator, I called the governor's office. They actually called me last because most people don't even know the lieutenant governor exists. And they sort of hear about the legislature and they hear about the governor. So they go through those first. And then we do try. Some people don't realize the lieutenant governor's office is all of two people. Lieutenant governor and lieutenant governor's chief of staff.
Right.
And we have 600,000 constituents. But we do try, and we fail, but we try to at least reach back, return an email, reply to a phone call. There are some people who call all the time, so you just don't have time to reply to them every time. Right. But we do hear from people who say, you are the first person that's answered my call. And I thank you for that. They're like, I don't agree with you, but I really appreciate that you did this. And I put out newsletters. This is another, I think this is another thing I'm pretty proud of, is we put out an email newsletter across the state. And it's often of various issues. We extended the opportunity to the Republican, the Democratic, and the Progressive Caucus leaders in the Senate. I said, we put out a newsletter. If you would like to get your message out to quite a few thousand Vermonters, let us know, and we can put it out there. That's then, let the chips fall where they may, because it's about information. And that newsletter is often about an issue that might be going on, excuse me, and we'll say, here's a resource and here's a resource, here's a little caption, but here's where you can get more information.
Good for you. That's great. That's great. Because I think people really want to know.
Right.
They just don't know how to find out. So that's a great way. So let me just ask you something. Why are you running for governor?
Sure.
Especially at this time, because you're running against an incumbent governor, and the history here in the state isn't
57 years, maybe,
exactly.
something like that.
But
who's
I read
counting?
that you said this was a good time for you.
Well, for those that don't know me, this will be information. For others who follow politics more closely, people have probably known that I've been a pretty active legislator. I'm someone who has figured that I have 2 years. You never know if you're going to get another 2 years or another 2 years. And you're sent there to get something done. You're sent there to improve people's lives. Now, different people's perspectives may have different ways of improving people's lives, and whether more or less government or in certain ways, that's the debate, right? But we're all sent there to, I think, help make everyday lives better. Different ways of doing it. And so I've always been very active in those roles and tried to push ideas and broaden conversation. And as Lieutenant Governor, I've had that opportunity, traveling the state as we just talked about, putting out the newsletter. But I've also found that you don't have as much voice in actual policymaking as one did as a legislator or one would as governor. Right. And I was going back and forth in my mind all last summer and fall. And a big area for me for many years has been around our climate and thinking about my daughter and the future of this planet she's going to live on. And I think about having grown up in the Boston area, we used to freeze our backyard and skate on it, right? As an ice skating rink. Like our garden had like a wooden boundary and we would skate on that. There is no way Boston has winters that would be naturally cold enough for that to happen anymore. I was lucky enough to sea kayak in Prince William Sound, Alaska. It happened to be the year of the Exxon Valdez. We went to an area that didn't have this spill. Many of the glaciers that I saw that used to calve into the ocean don't even reach the ocean anymore. Yeah. And this is a problem over time. And granted, some may be natural, but it's pretty clear from science that it's also our activities are impacting the climate crisis. And so this has been a major issue for me and for 20 years. And as the years go by, especially more recently, the severity of the challenge to turn this ship around is getting much, much steeper very quickly. And there were reports last fall in particular that really elevated how short a timeline we have. And most people said, you know, David, if you wait 2 years, the governor's not that happy in the job anyway, was a sentiment some people have. He's probably not going to do more than 2 more years. Just wait. It'll be easier to run then. And I've never run for when it's easy or because that's the convenient thing to do. I've served to get something done. And I decided, you know, between the climate crisis, the rural economy, our dairy farmers for the last 3-4 years have really struggled, the need for more local food, the need for the rural economy to be rebuilt because it's really hollowing out, especially southern 4 counties of Vermont. I'm going to try. And I'm either going to get in there and be able to try to get things done, or I'm going to fail. But either way, there's other people who can do all of these jobs well. And I didn't think there was anybody else who would give the governor a run for his money. So I went for it. Now things have changed a bit, but from when that decision was made. But I think it's a winnable race. Yeah. I think the issues of rural poverty in particular, although as you point out, homeless in Burlington, economic disparities in income have really grown in the last 20, 25 years that I've been in office, and maybe for longer. And we're really at this fairly desperate point. It seems like everything's at a tipping point. Water quality, the dairy industry and agriculture, people's economic, destitute, and that's been amplified by COVID many times over. So we have some big, big issues, and they're going to take leadership.
So let me just ask you, if you met a person, say a woman around 77, who is still not convinced about climate change, what would you say to her? It's me. What would you say to her?
It couldn't have been you because you're not 77.
No, yes, I am. But anyway, I'm just not there. I'm close, but I'm not there. And because you hear so many, no, it's nonsense, and yes, it's important, and it's sort of confusing. Right. And then my other issue is because Vermont is so tiny, what can we do to make a difference?
Sure. I mean, ultimately, each one of us is a solo individual, and some could argue, whatever any of us does, it doesn't matter. On the other hand, the flip side of that is cumulatively, each of our actions has an effect. Right. As more and more of us do something, it has an effect. The science, and I appreciate that you may not be convinced, but the science is pretty darn clear. I mean, 95, 98% of scientists, climate scientists, are in agreement that we have not seen this kind of change in CO2 levels and atmospheric gases and temperatures in global history, other than like catastrophic sort of massive volcanic eras or things that were really major sudden shifts or an asteroid hitting the planet kind of thing. And there's pretty clear connection to the carbon release from fossil fuel consumption. And I'm not going to convince you now if you haven't been convinced, but the science is pretty straightforward.
I would like to read and know where to look for the,
Okay.
I won't say the truth, but something that's honest.
Well,
That's a good word.
we know that Exxon, for instance, 30 years ago,
Right.
knew this information and they buried it. You know, we see that large corporations who, and this is not a individual fault of the corporation or the head of the corporation, but it is the job of a company that's on Wall Street. Their bottom line is to return the investment and to make money in stocks and pay out dividends.
Right.
And when that's your bottom line, decisions can be made sometimes that say, you know what, that information may be important, but it's not really going to hurt today if nobody knows. And if people learn that, it's going to hurt our quarter over quarter earnings, and we can't do that. My job is to make money for this company. And so we have seen that happen over and over again. A more recent episode would be with opioids, right? We know the pharmaceutical industry said, these aren't addictive.
Oh, right, for sure.
Right? And yet they knew they were, and now that's coming out with the documentation. Same is true with PFOA and PFAS. Those chemicals, it's very clear, there's a movie called The Devil We Know, that they knew this back in the 70s, that these chemicals would cause genetic defects in offspring, particularly of women, but it would affect males' genetic reproductive issues as well. And so we are, so just knowing that the fossil fuel industry suppressed that information. But also the data, I mean, if you go, well, prior to this president, onto the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's website, you look at Dr. Hansen, one of the lead climate scientists in the country, who ultimately left under the, I think he left under the Trump administration. He couldn't take it anymore because of the gag order that the Trump administration put in. But yeah, we could talk for hours about this.
Maybe one way to think of it, Pat, is similar to how in Montpelier, every little bit of spending here, $1 million here, $1 million there, every little bit of spending adds up to suddenly a big impact on the budget.
Right.
A lot of that's with that same, the same with your personal actions in the climate. But how do you address that for folks who maybe agree, 100% on board, acknowledge that the problem is here,
What do you do?
it's happening, we need to address it, but then we see things like carbon taxes and some of these associated costs that come with the actions.
Right.
And people they look at their current financial situation,
I
they
can't pay
can't
anymore.
imagine.
It's really bad.
And whether or not they could, there's ways they could sacrifice, or maybe they can't come up with the money at all. How do you balance that?
Two things. I'm going to give you a quote. Senator Dirksen said at one time, and there's Dirksen Building in Washington.
Yeah, right.
He said $1 billion here and $1 billion there, and soon you're talking real money. So that goes right with
There
your
you go,
prior
right, that's it.
statement.
Well, I've noticed they talk about stronger storms.
Well, I was going to say,
we've had a lot of storms that are much, is that the word? I don't know, stronger.
well, they're more powerful, they're more
Yeah.
intense. So, for instance, the question is, what's the cost of doing nothing? The cost in the Louisiana coast right now is millions and millions. Katrina was billions, Superstorm Sandy, hurricane or tropical storm Irene at that point. We are seeing more of these storms. So there is a cost, and we will all pay for it. We will either pay for it through taxes or through debt, which is now like the easy way to get out of everything. Just give money away without having it come from anywhere, and then we have to pay it back. So, the question is, how do we do it in a way that doesn't really stranglehold those who are living right on that fiscal cliff? And I would argue, and of course there's debates about this, I would argue that ever since Reaganomics, when Reagan came into office, the marginal tax rate on the wealthiest people in this country was closer to 70%. And I think in the last Trump tax cut, it's dropped to right over 30 or just under 30%. In the roaring, great economy of the 50s, when America was great, for those that buy into that rhetoric, in the 1950s and back into the 30s, the top marginal tax rate at the federal level was between 80 and 90%. And the former president of Ford, Henry Ford, spoke at the time. He said, we have to pay our workers enough that they can afford to buy the cars. And so you didn't have the pay disparity that you have of today, where the top people in some of the big businesses, I mean, look at Bezos. During the COVID crisis, his net wealth has gone up nearly $50 billion because of people buying things online.
Sure, making money.
So you sit there and go, okay, look at the struggles we have right now. This guy, instead of being worth $250 billion or whatever it is he is worth, is now worth $50 billion more. I do say, and I'll be more than frank about it, does he need $50 billion more dollars?
Right. What can you do with it?
Could Vermont's whole
Right.
of $115 million? I
Right.
mean, $50 billion wouldn't save all the budgets of the country, but when you start to look at some of these people's net worth, and you go, okay, right now, we could either put money into these communities, build affordable housing, weatherize people's homes. So here's how I would tackle the climate crisis without it being so much of a nail working people in the pocketbook answer. If we took the top 5% of Vermonters, that's ballpark $250,000 income a year and greater, and we said to them, you know what, you just got each year about a $200 to $250 million tax break from the Trump tax cuts. What if the state were to take half of that during the tenure of the tax cuts, which I think is 3 or 4 more years, and say, you know what, keep half of that, put it into Wall Street, invest it however you want. It's not really trickling down. They're not building 16 more decks on their homes. They're not building 7 more pools. They're not putting Vermonters to work with it. It's going to Wall Street.
Right.
What if we took half of that, 120 million a year, and we put 20 million into expanding broadband into our rural areas?
Right.
How many people could live and work at home, say 2 or 3 days a week, and then commute 2 or 3 days a week to work? That's less driving, that's less fossil fuel, that's a climate mitigation issue, and that's an economic development tool. What if we took 20 million a year and we said, we're going to put this into affordable housing in our downtown and village centers? Now, I think a few years ago, the legislature, with the governor's leadership, did a $30-odd million bond for affordable housing.
Yep.
If my numbers are right, it leveraged almost $200 to $250 million in housing development, and particularly affordable housing development. And then they said, we can't do anymore. We can't bond for any more money because we're taking out too much debt. So we've talked about doing it again. Treasurer Pierce has been, I don't know, I don't feel good about our bond rating.
Right.
The governor said we can't do any more. So what if we said, all right, we're going to take $20 million a year for the next 3 years or 5 years and put it into affordable housing and keep leveraging other. Putting a ton of people to work, which right now, trade skills and so forth, you know, you don't need a college degree to be a carpenter or a plumber. What if we put $20 million a year into weatherizing working class people's homes and fixed income seniors' homes? They don't have the money to put into their homes up front for what is an absolute economic return where you use less energy, your fuel bill goes down, you save money, and you're helping the environment. Let's put people to work and save working class Vermonters money. Fixed income seniors are struggling. The COLA on Social Security has not gone up very much the last few years. What if we said to them, we're going to lower your bill, even if you have to pay this back at a 0 interest or 0.01% interest? What if we lowered your bill by $75 a month and you had to pay $60 a month to cover this interest?
Wow.
Or this debt back. $15 a month. How many meals is that for a
sure.
senior? How much does that help a working class family? So most of the time, the efforts put forth are fees and regressive taxes. And they immediately get attacked by those who are concerned about taxes and able to leverage the political sentiment of the majority of Vermonters who are struggling to get by with just the broad, no new taxes. But what I'm talking about is a tax on the top 5%. Unless you make over $250,000, which probably most
not.
of these people are not
Right.
those people,
Right.
it wouldn't affect them. We've had years under both Democratic and Republican governors saying, no taxes in the big, broad scheme of things. Well, what do? They raise your fees, your motor vehicle registration
yes.
fee, your
Don't get me
tax,
started on that.
your tax on your vehicle that
Yep.
you buy. I just bought a used truck for my farm, $15,000 truck, $900 6%
Right,
tax.
right.
I'm looking at how can we adjust that at least for the first couple thousand or 5 or 10,000 and say, you know what? For working people that are struggling to buy a car to get to work, That's too much money.
Right, exactly. I
It's too
agree
much
with you.
money.
The fees, and there's somebody that is no longer on the Ways and Means Committee, but we would argue all the time. I said, if you're charging more fees on registration, that is a tax because it hits everybody.
Yep.
It's not just a few people that select to get their car registered. We require it. It's a tax.
And-
oh, no, Pat,
Right.
it's a fee.
Well,
No.
no, it is technically by definition a fee, but everybody's pocket's going to get hit
Exactly.
by it. It's one thing, I've been a proponent of taxing and regulating cannabis. Well, you don't pay it if you don't buy it.
Right.
Who can afford not to have a car? You've got to get to work.
Exactly.
Now, maybe if you live right in the heart of Burlington or right on a bus line in Chittenden County and a couple other spots, you can be lucky enough to live near one stop and get to work at another stop. But we don't have the public transportation system or the proximity to work. You have to have a car. That's a basic necessity.
Right.
So my thought, and I'm still trying to crunch the numbers, and you're hearing it before anybody else, even before I've thought it all the way through, which is going to get me in trouble someday. But I was wondering, where is the tipping point that if you were to eliminate the purchase and use tax on a vehicle under the first $5,000 or $10,000 of value, and I don't know where the line is, and then on the remaining above that, instead of 6%, it went to 7%. So you'd have to be cost neutral to the coffers. We don't have
Right,
money to
right.
throw around. There's a point where you would pay less money all the way up to $20,000, $30,000, even $35,000
Right,
worth of car
right.
because of that exemption for the first $5,000. And so it would be it's sort of like rooms or meals tax, or wrong, clothing tax.
Oh, clothing, right.
We have a tax on clothing
Yeah, right.
if it's over $110,
$100.
$100.
Yeah.
We know you need clothing,
Right.
so we don't tax it until it gets to a more luxury item.
Yeah.
Well,
Same with cars.
cars, you need a car to get to work.
Very nice. I
so
like that.
I'm thinking about an idea to present like that. I got to
Yeah.
crunch the numbers. But
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, that makes a lot of sense because the clothing, it just allows people to buy what they need, and then if they want to splurge or
Right.
whatever, you pay tax.
you need clothing
Yeah,
and you
you
need a
need
car to go to work. It's
Yeah,
not good
right.
to show up naked in a car to get to
No,
work.
it's not.
Doesn't work out so well.
Stay
They
tuned.
might call in some mental health folks if you do that.
Exactly. But that's allowed here in Vermont, right? Well,
You can
long
be
as you leave
naked.
your home,
be
right?
naked
Yes,
as long as you leave your
can't
house, right?
strip in public, but you can be.
you can leave your house naked. Maybe not.
Let's keep on this train then. So what
Trains are good too.
Trains are good. Yes, we've tried that.
Yeah, they were trying to do some new train development
Oh,
recently,
I know. They just
right?
could give it up.
They're making progress. There's a connection up in Burlington. They're trying to connect where it loops back out to Essex Junction, because then you could start to have trains
It's
going
really
through.
cool. Have you been on that dinner train?
I have not.
It is fabulous. We went with friends, and it just takes you through. It's just so beautiful, this
yeah.
state. And we had fabulous, just 5 stars. It was incredible. We had a great evening.
Oh, nice.
It's cool.
But you weren't going with trains.
No,
you were going with something
no.
else.
I didn't mean trains. I meant something else.
Yeah, so let's keep talking about some of your priorities that you would want to put forward if you won
Sure.
this race.
Do you want me to talk about them?
What-
Oh, I
yeah,
didn't know if you were gonna
open-ended
peg me.
question,
I thought you were going to
open-ended
peg me
question.
on one of them. Well, when I announced I was running, it was really about our rural economy, struggling Vermonters, and our sort of agricultural opportunities and ways to really, and I touched on some of this earlier, if we were to take those resources for 3 or 4 years and build affordable housing in our rural village centers and create enough critical mass that maybe a coffee shop could open again. If you're working from home with decent broadband, well, in the middle of the day, you take a break and you go get a sandwich every day. Out in southern end of Heinsberg, where I live, there used to be a little store around the corner. It was a gas station and a sandwich shop. And it was right across from a quarry. And I learned the other day that like a bit of their bread and butter was all the quarry workers every day
sure.
coming over for lunch.
Right.
Well, if in town you had 15 or 30 people making decent money on a software or internet-based business, or somewhere you could work with, you could be an architect and do a lot of your work sending drafts designs to your clients in Boston or New
Yeah.
York. But every day you want to stretch your legs. So you go out, you get a cup of coffee and a sandwich at the local
Right.
school. So let's rebuild our local economy by building affordable housing, by getting broadband into these rural areas. Think about southern Vermont. You are 2 hours from Boston, Connecticut, parts of New York City. There are people who would love to live in southern Vermont, attend very good rural schools, have their kids grow up in a safe environment away from whatever nervousness you have about urban areas, although they are safer than people think. There's a lot of hullabaloo there. But now with COVID, if you have good broadband, you could start having
For
people
sure.
who make $110,000,
Right.
$160,000 incomes
Work
as
at home.
lawyers or consultants or software engineers or marketing specialists
Right.
or video designers, where again, if you live there and you had to meet your clients every 4 to 6 weeks in Boston,
Right.
you go down, you rent a hotel room for a night or two, you meet with 8 clients over 2 or 3 days, and you come home for 6 weeks with your family.
Right.
That's kind of a dream come true.
Yeah.
And so these investments are to build the economy, in the economy that people are looking for. Vermont already has a pretty good reputation for high quality product, community thinking, environmentally thinking. You know how many people come to Vermont and go, the billboards? They just think that alone.
Thank
right?
you, Governor Dean.
That's
Yeah.
right. Dean Davis, right?
Yeah. No, Governor Dean.
Billboards?
Yes.
I thought it was even before that.
No, because I
Oh.
wrote him a letter to thank him. I went on vacation
Great.
one time. I couldn't see any of the stores for
Right.
the billboards, and I wrote him and I said, thank you.
Right.
You know?
So to me, it's economic development in our rural areas. It's also looking at our dairy farms. I have talked for a long time. Sometimes you shouted to the wind for a while. I started bringing up cannabis reform in 1994, so we're still talking about it. Sometimes things take a while.
Yeah.
But our dairy industry, as long as it's competing in the commodity market, is going to be really, really tough. We just don't have the economy of scale and
sure.
The landscape to really make that work. We work with smaller specialized dairies, and we've got a few bigger dairies, but that in-between size is really struggling. I don't
Yep.
think I have to tell anybody this.
Yeah.
But again, our advantage in Vermont compared to rural Nebraska or Wyoming is our proximity to market. Vermont produces about 1.1 to 1.2% of the nation's milk. If we had no dairies tomorrow, no one in the country would notice, but it would be devastating for
Right,
Vermont.
for us.
So let's pull our milk and move it towards a specialized product from a commodity product. Now, some people want Vermont to go all organic. Now, I recognize there's problems with that in a couple of ways.
Yeah.
One,
Expensive.
the organic market doesn't have enough consumers to warrant that. Two, there's a lot of Vermonters and others that can't afford it. That's why there's not as much market yet. It's pretty tricky to produce products
Right.
that way. But there's a lot of conversation about regenerative agriculture, and you're going to see the connection here. This is related to climate crisis. There's really good evidence out there that one of the best ways to bring carbon back out of the atmosphere is through rotational grazing, through actually cows being a good thing for the environment, because the process of grazing the land, it used to be bison roamed this whole country.
Right.
And they would graze and move on, and the grasses would grow, roots would grow. You build carbon matter in your soil quite quickly, by the way. We could actually, those 30-year ago glaciers I saw,
Right.
we could reduce the carbon in the atmosphere in about that same 30 years if nationwide and globally we had an aggressive regenerative agriculture method. It is not nearly the cost for the consumer of organic, but it could get a better return on price for our farmers. They would be building their soil. They would need fewer inputs, which is very expensive. Now, are we going to flick a switch and do that overnight? Of course not. Folks know that, like I said, I've fought for issues for a long time,
Yeah.
and you also have to be methodical about, adjusting the system. And if dairy farmers don't want to do it, I'm not going to make them do anything.
Right.
But they're going to have a choice:
that's an
economic
opportunity.
survival
Right.
or an economic
And
opportunity.
doesn't the land, in order to be organic, the land has to have been maintained in a certain way for...
Well, 3
for-
years.
For 3 years, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And regenerative agriculture is something that you do over time as well. You plant more cover crops, you do less tillage, but you don't have to wait 3 years necessarily to be
Oh.
certified. Is regenerative agriculture the perfect way to go? There's more exploring to do, but I don't think we can just keep on the path of let's kind of do it as we've always done. There's water quality issues.
Oh,
Here's
yeah.
another thing about regenerative agriculture. When you build organic matter, you have soil that can act like a better sponge. So when those heavy rains come and water runs off the surface and pollutes our waterways, it will actually be more sponge-like and you'll have less runoff into our waterways. So it's a twofer. It helps with climate, a threefer. It helps with the economics of a farm, hopefully, and it helps with water quality issues. So I've gotten a little deep on regenerative agriculture, but our rural economy needs a boost. And for those who live in Chittenden County, there's a lot of finger pointing at Chittenden County from the rest of the state, and I think it's kind of
Oh,
funny.
the other Vermont?
Your box on your map is like Chittenden County
that's
centered.
true.
I don't know if you've ever noticed that.
No, I did actually.
But it's it's a two-edged sword for Vermonters. Chittenden County produces a lot of the income for this state.
For sure.
It definitely sends more income out than it gets in. It's sort of like southern states hating on Washington and yet getting more money than they send to Washington.
Right.
So it's good for Chittenden County if we rebuild the rural economy. It's good for the rural economy and rural Vermonters if we build the rural economy. So a lot of that is my focus.
So for a while in Montpelier, there was an effort, I don't know how vocal it was, but an effort to move people into the cities, to use the empty buildings that are here, like say Barry is once again struggling with it. But I wasn't too crazy about that idea, and I was very pleased to see on your website the idea of building the rural areas up, because that's really why people are here. They really don't want to live in the city environment, do they? I mean, I love the space I have.
Right. Well, I want to be careful about how it's
Yeah.
interpreted to make sure you know what I'm saying and don't get misled.
Thank you for that.
I believe in building the village centers and the town centers. I do think if there's old abandoned buildings, we should figure out how to make sure
agree
the
with that.
toxic site,
Right.
and Matt Dunn talked a lot about this in terms
He's
of
doing
brownfield
great
stuff.
job.
And really, we should reuse buildings that we have
Right.
and turn them into housing. But there's a lot of expense to that. It's cheaper to build on a fresh piece of land than it is to clean up and rebuild on an old building. So we have to look at ways to help with that. But I don't think we should actually be sprawling out and having everybody with 5 or 10 or 12 acres. That's actually one of the reasons we have some of the most driver mileage per person in the country is in Vermont.
I didn't know
Because
that.
we're scattered all about.
Right.
And it is absolutely lovely to have the peace and quiet. But if you go to many of our small towns, if they went from, 15 houses to 42 houses, it's still going to be pretty quiet and walkable. You're going to be able to walk out the back and go into people's back 30s and 40s and have paths and trails and have that peaceful environment that people are looking for. But I'm not talking about incentivizing people to build on 13 and 17 acre
I
lots with
understand
long
that part.
driveways.
Right.
I do want to have it be a little denser than that.
Okay.
I mean, it's not just me. I think
Yeah.
for many people's lifestyle, that's a walkable community. and
Right.
people
Well,
want
maybe
that.
as one gets older.
Well, that's also.
I know my mother lived here in town and she loved it because she could, in her 80s and early 90s, she could
Yeah.
walk to
Yeah.
a place and instead of, asking us to drive around, which we didn't mind. But
Sure.
it's good.
Yeah, sure.
So you covered economics pretty well there. Campaign for Vermont focuses on economics, ethics, and education. So I'd like to hear some about that from
Yeah.
you. So maybe starting with education, we've seen Act 46 has not shown the benefits that it was said that we would have.
Yeah.
There's that Vermont education is very expensive. What are some of your ideas for addressing this?
Yeah, there's a couple things. One is Vermont education is expensive because we're spread all out. Same sort of thing.
Right.
Huge expenses are busing and transportation. We have a lot of small schools, and I think we really value those small schools. And I think one of the downsides of Act 46 was now there's pressure to close some of them. I was on the education committee. I will own my part of Act 46. I worked on that bill. We talked a lot about trying to have the new governance structures make sure there were rights for those towns that would say no school could be closed without, for instance, a unanimous vote, or for at least 10 or 15 years until people got a sense of how important those towns are. Some of that was not implemented in some of those articles of incorporation of those new school districts.
Right.
So there's some real strain there, and that wasn't what we envisioned. We thought the advice and the coaching to those organizations would be to make sure there were those protective caveats.
Yeah, the school board, they ran a little free with their interpretation.
They
and
may
took
have,
a little
you know,
authority
but-
that they
Because
didn't have.
they didn't take when towns develop their own, because the act said they would consider looking at alternatives, but I don't think they looked at them as well as they should have.
Well, and also we built in alternative structures to allow towns not to have to, or districts not to have to merge. And we
Right,
were under the
right.
impression that there would be 25 to 40 that would not be forced to combine. And the administrations of originally the Shumlin administration and then the Scott administration ultimately pushed through
Wow.
very much, you
Yeah,
need to merge.
Right.
But this was an idea that I brought in my one meeting, back to the topic we had
Right.
earlier. I've had one meeting with Governor Scott face to face in 4 years. And it was me approaching him to say, look at the division in Washington. We know in Vermont, like you and I are different parties,
Right.
and we have a decent rapport.
Yes,
we can talk and find ways of agreement. We can find ways to disagree amicably, but let's find what we can agree on and do it as best we can. And I said to the governor, you know, this country needs some symbolism. And he and I said, you and I could do something together and show that people of different parties, once elected and governing, can take their job of governance to be the most important thing and good results, more than the partisan bickering that we see. And one of the biggest issues I brought, because that first year he was big on education, he asked for moving town meeting day and revoting budgets. He vetoed the budget in order to not put money that was going to go into the education pension fund for the teachers. And there was just a lot of battle around schools. And I said, why don't we take our frontline workers in education and ask them, what's the driving cost? And right now, one of the big drivers of cost in education is sort of human services development and redevelopment and help for kids that are really struggling. And that's put on the backs of the property taxes and the education fund. And yet we have this whole other silo of the Agency of Human Services that's also servicing these families and meeting the needs and trying to help families that are struggling. I said we have the two biggest silos of government, $2.4 billion, $1.7 billion. Together, they're 2/3 of the state's budget,
Right.
working with these same families. Why don't we, instead of having 14 or 12 human service hubs around the state, that for some families are a 30-minute drive in a one-car family where one parent's working one shift, another parent's working another, who's got the time with the car to go touch point human services until your kids are in school? Well, we've learned that by the time they're 5, a lot of the impacts have already been done. So why not have in every school a touch point for human services and look at reducing the overlap of the education and the human services world and say, let's save some money. That overlap is 2 people working in the same family. That seems redundant and expensive for government. And if we touch people earlier, we may be able to address issues earlier and really reduce the lifetime consequence of certain circumstances. So we could potentially save money, we could potentially create a better continuum of service, and really improve the lives of Vermonters. So for education expenses, I would look there. Now, are we going to save money in year 1? No way. Probably not even year 2 or 3. This is going to be a project that may take more than one biennium. That's why I approached the governor on it. I said, look, if you as a Republican and me as a progressive Democrat go out there and say, we're hand in hand working on this long-term fix to a major problem, stick with us for a few years. Give us a chance. Because what happens in governing, and you know this better than many, with a 2-year biennium, if you don't produce results right away, you have to be held accountable for a big idea. So you never get system-changing ideas because they're too complicated, they're too difficult, and you can't get the buy-in because the people at the bottom go, you might be gone in 2 or 4 years. I'm not going to invest in your big shenanigan changes that we know people are going to vote you out before we get the results. So I'm willing to talk about those things, whether I stay in office or not, because we need system changes for efficiency. That isn't just saying efficiency, it's saying I'm willing to roll up my sleeves, go to the frontline workers, ask the key questions, and involve them in the process. If we think up here at the top of a 6,000 person state employee and then another, 8,000 teachers and others, that you're going to have all the answers up here with those 14,000 people with their on-the-ground experience. Let's get down to the ground level. I mean, I'm a farmer. I get on the ground level all the time.
They probably have the answers if you ask them, because that's what I've always found.
Well, you were at DMV, right? You would go to the front line.
The employees did it all.
Yep.
We changed DMV from top to bottom, and I only had 2 ideas that were implemented. Everything else came from the employees.
Right. That's what we've got to do.
Just ask them. I have to compliment you. Make sure people look at your website. David has all of his priorities: jobs and the economy, the environment, rural Vermont, education, and an area that he calls Vermont for All. And I was so excited to see that you included the Abenaki in your response, because we've had some shows with one of the chiefs, and I mean, their history and their love for this country, for this state, is just amazing. So I thought that was great.
Absolutely.
And especially your support of LGBTQIA. They added IA. I had to learn that. Took me 2 years to get LGBTQ down, but they all deserve to be Vermonters. And
Well, and everybody does. You know,
Yeah.
rural Vermonters are feeling, you know, some traditional Vermonters are feeling that their way of life is under attack right now. And I think we have to discuss sort of in what way, right?
Right.
Because sometimes it's a feeling and sometimes it's real evidence of that. But, you know, we have such a great range of people.
right.
And I think as long as we treat each other with respect and do welcome everyone as an individual who's going to prove their merit on how they treat other people,
Right.
then we can be a welcoming state. And, you know, there's a lot of people that don't feel welcome right now. And it's not that we have to overemphasize or say, we're going to focus on these people, therefore you don't matter. You know, we are,
Right.
when we have so
Everybody.
many people struggling, they say, why are you caring about their struggle and not my struggle? I'm a 6th generation Vermonter. My struggle should be more important than a 1 generation Vermonter. And it's like, actually, these struggles are ubiquitous, and we need to be tackling, in my opinion, the economic inequity that exists.
It's there.
And that's gonna help.
I think we have 4% total minorities. And I think if we were to really try, I think 4% of the population should be able to be helped and supported, because it's not like a 50%, you know.
Yeah, the expense isn't going to be that great if it's
No,
for,
just
you know.
these people deserve it. So I was glad to see that. I
Well,
thought that was great.
And we're dealing with legacy issues, whether it's our water quality, whether it's systemic racism,
Right.
and there may be some viewers that don't believe in that. But, you know,
Well, I learned to,
communities of color have 1/10 the wealth per person as white people do. And when you actually look at the laws over the years, the GI Bill, black veterans didn't get access to the GI Bill as white Americans did.
really?
You look at the 70s and you look at the redlining issue. And some of that was government policy. A lot of it was just banking policy that wouldn't loan money to people in communities of color to buy houses in certain communities. They always had to buy them in these redlined communities. So you saw this segregated activity in terms of where money would be loaned. You look now this year, a lot of people learned about the Tulsa Massacre. Did you hear about
Yes, oh
that?
yes,
Right?
right,
Many
right.
people had no idea
Right.
about that before this year. But there was a thriving black economic culture in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and white people went in and said, you're getting too uppity for yourselves. And they burned the banks and the stores and the institutions and murdered many, many black Americans. So there has been these systemic issues. The war on drugs. Nixon had the opportunity in the early 70s when he was reviewing cannabis reform, which is where the war on drugs came from. His panel said, we should reform our cannabis laws. I guess we're running low on
Yeah, we have a
time.
little, that's
But
okay.
this is related. And he turned around and said, you know what? We're going to double down on cannabis laws. We're going to put people in jail. And it was for 2 reasons. It was all political. One was to suppress the civil rights movement, and one was to suppress the peace movement and the hippies and all that.
Right.
And so when we use our laws and criminal justice or injustice for political purposes, we have crossed a line. And we've done it over and over and over through history. And people are fed up. They've had enough. And, you know, you're still seeing it just a couple days ago in Wisconsin.
Oh, my God.
Someone gets shot in the back multiple times. How are we training our law enforcement? If
Right.
you have to shoot someone,
Right.
why are we aiming for the vital organs that are more likely to lead to a death versus, you know, maybe it's harder to hit someone in the leg.
Right.
Maybe it's better not to shoot someone. I mean, there's maybe an instance where that person has done a violent crime to somebody else and you get to take law into your hands as a law
Right.
enforcement officer and shoot someone back. But it's supposed to be the courts that determine guilt or innocence. And somewhere in training, in our cultural understanding, we've crossed the line.
Yeah. Well, I don't
so-
think they're paying attention to what imminent harm means.
Right.
I'm actually going and learning how to shoot. And the guy that's teaching
I
us
think I
is-
saw that on
yeah,
Facebook.
The guy that's teaching us was talking about when somebody has a knife, how close they have to be for it to be imminent danger.
Interesting.
Because there's a momentum when you,
Sure.
so that even if you shoot them, they may still come forward to you.
Yeah.
And there's a lot, but in the back, that's no. I mean, if they're leaving with a TV, that's a no,
Right.
because they're just stealing a dumb TV.
It's an
so who
object,
right.
you know?
So there's a lot
It's a
of things
potted
you learn.
plant on a shelf.
And I'm surprised, I mean, 7 times in the back is sort of,
So I learned recently that the average law enforcement officer gets 60 hours of firearms training. And probably some of that is that imminent harm and understanding
right.
when and when
Well,
not to
that's
use it.
the law,
So you should learn how to use it
Yeah.
properly, no doubt about it. And 4 hours in community relations and community building.
Right, that's not much. is it?
And thankfully, we've had really good experience up in Franklin County with some law enforcement resources being used to bring a mental health counselor with law enforcement
Yes, they're
to
working on that.
de-escalate situations. And we're looking at that statewide.
Right.
But we need to really be thinking about the role of law enforcement, but what are the other people that could help
Yes.
de-escalate situations so that law enforcement doesn't have to
Here
be
in
involved at all?
Montpelier, they have a thing called Team 2, where they bring in mental health, and
Right.
they train together. So when they go to a home and there's an issue of a mental health individual with a gun, they all know how to deal with it, and that's become very effective, apparently.
Right.
Well, and I think that's what people don't understand when they hear the term defund police.
Well,
they
that's
don't
a terrible set of
understand
wording because
Yeah.
that means zero.
Yeah.
and
Right.
that's not
It's
what we're
not
talking
about.
about
Then you
getting
can't.
rid of police. It's about using those assets to bring in people that will reduce the need for police and
Yeah.
bring in those
And
mental health
incarceration.
Right,
The expense of
exactly, right.
incarcerating people in this country.
Yeah.
We incarcerate more people in this country than any other country in the
Do
world.
you know we don't have any air conditioning in prisons? I'm sorry, I just got on this thing with
Yeah.
Dave Bellini the other day. No air conditioning, and you certainly can't open the windows because
Right.
if they're in jail. I mean, it must have been awful.
Back
this
in
summer.
June, I know in the
Yeah.
fields when our crops were burning
No
up, it
air
was
conditioning.
awful.
Those are the things that's like, what
It's
are we
inhumane.
doing?
It's
Yeah,
inhumane.
what are we doing?
Well, we're almost at the end here.
All
but
right.
it's all right if we go over a minute or two, I think. I want to hear really quickly about your stance on putting in statute, and this is probably the most pointed question of the day here, putting in statute a state code of ethics.
Oh, I think we should. I met with the gentleman from, I don't remember what organization, but they've been putting out information about that, and they put out a report this summer.
Larry Novins.
Yeah, Larry
and
Novins,
I think
yeah,
that
Ethics
day,
Commission.
one of the other candidates for governor had a press conference on ethics, but then
Ah.
couldn't point to individual examples about the governor. And I do think it's important that we use clear examples and don't use innuendo, because ethics is very difficult. When you're in politics, you get accused of things like, wait, I'm human.
Right.
A, I might have made a mistake, or B, is that really the full story? But I'm all for revealing information, and I was revealing information about my income for years
Right.
when it didn't need to be by law. People, it's funny, they don't tend to look at it because they're like, you're a such and such. I'm like, look at my income from 4 and
Yeah, right,
5 years
right,
ago.
exactly.
Like, I was living on 60 and 52 grand and 38 grand a year. But anyway, there is both a face-to-face reality in Vermont where we know more about each other than the average person knows about the governor of New York State, where I think more disclosure is necessary because you just could never get that information from the horse's mouth. On the other hand, it's taxpayer dollars, it's being hired with the public trust, and people want to know they can trust you and trust that whether they agree with you or not, you're going to have ethics and morals. And I've got no problem with there being a code of ethics. Now, the challenge is, how is that defined?
And- yeah.
And I think there are people who have far more knowledge than me about how to draft those up in a way that is both information for the public and not, I gotcha.
Right.
that's-
Done correctly.
Because once you say something, you better
Yeah.
know you're right.
Right.
That's right.
Done correctly, it's a great educational tool. It's not meant to be an I gotcha. That's what
Right.
we believe,
Right.
anyways.
Yep.
Yeah, because you could ruin somebody's life if you were incorrect.
There's been accusations about me that are just not true. And I know that once they're out there for 40,
For sure.
60, or 100,000
Right.
people to
And if
think.
it helps somebody's personal narrative, they don't care if it's true
You
or
know.
not.
Right.
But
Anyway, we must end the show.
Yeah.
David, I'm thrilled that you
It's
were
always a
here. I
pleasure.
really wish you a lot of luck.
Thank you.
And I'm going to try to figure out how to get one of those ice cream things. I got to get that.
Well,
That's great.
it's
I know-
a
I know
donation.
you have to donate.
You got to donate. But if you donate less than $100,
My name
nobody will
doesn't show
know
up.
that
Okay.
you donated.
All
So you can donate $1 and get put in
Thank
the
you.
raffle.
All
Or
right.
99 or even 100.
There you go. Is it 100 or 99?
It is 100. It is
100.
over 100 gets
okay.
reported and 100 or less does
Yeah.
not. People are often confused. So if you feel safer doing it as 99, that's
Check his website. It is really excellent, and it's well worded and gives you a lot of information that we didn't touch on tonight. But I encourage you to go to check out his website. And we'll see you next week. And in the meantime, keep listening beyond the soundbite.